There have been many fearsome warrior tribes to emerge from the Eurasian steppe. You may have heard about some of them through Dan Carlin's fantastic episodes, The Wrath of the Khans. And here on Villains and Virgins podcast, we just wrapped up a mini-series on Attila the Hun, where we looked at the emergence of the Huns from the Eurasian steppe and into Europe. And there's been this pattern of these various different tribes coming out of the same geographical area and pushing westwards, displacing and terrorizing other groups that have settled in their path. The Eurasian steppe itself is a vast expanse. It covers some 8,000 kilometers or 5,000 miles. The Huns are one example of this movement, emerging from somewhere near modern Kazakhstan, historians think, and pushing westwards to settle on the plains of what is now Hungary. But steppe peoples weren't just pushing against Europe, they were also pushing against Asia and the Near East. There were many, many different steppe tribes, not just the Huns, but also the Xiongnu, the Sarmatians, the Alans, the Visigoths, and the Scythians. And of course, who could forget the Mongols, perhaps the most terrifying and successful of all the steppe tribes. The Mongols were responsible for utter devastation and horrific slaughter in the 13th century as they built up their empire. The Mongols conquered China, Persia, India, Iran, Iraq, parts of Syria, as well as Turkey. Their empire eventually extended from Korea in the east to Poland in the west, forming what historians think is possibly one of the largest land-based empires in history. But we have to remember, the Mongols and these other tribes were pushing against other people who also had weapons. They also had bows and horses and a history of fighting. So why is it that tribes that came out of the Eurasian steppe were so remarkably successful in defeating these other groups of people? Of course, there was leadership, there was technology, and there was training. And in this episode, we're going to focus quite specifically on some of the training that made steppe peoples so successful. Welcome to War Games of the Eurasian Steppe on Villains and Virgins podcast. And this podcast is available as an audio stream anywhere you like listening to audio. So Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, all of those places. And the illustrated or video version is available on YouTube, as well as on my Instagram account if you search for Eva Schubert. We're going to begin by talking about the Mongols, since they successfully held perhaps the largest amount of territory of all the steppe peoples. And the Mongols had many different methods for refining their battle technique. In fact, they even had an officer training academy that specialized in siege warfare. This is amazing, and perhaps it's one of the reasons the Mongols were able to reach much, much farther than the Huns did. You will recall, if you listened to the episode on the Huns, that they specialized in rapid movement. So they were devastatingly effective horseback archers. They could move very, very quickly, but they hadn't yet evolved enough technique to deal with the fortified cities that they were going to encounter in Europe. Those things slowed them down, and they required a different method of fighting, as well as very specialized machines and tactics, and this is siege warfare. So the Mongols addressed this problem quite specifically in this training school that was designed for officers who learned all the tactics, learned how to use the machines, learned the strategies that were necessary to scale walls of cities under fire from the defenders and successfully invade. And these officers took that knowledge into the field and were very successful in mobilizing their men to perform these maneuvers with great success. But it wasn't just siege warfare. There were other training activities that were designed to exercise the entire army, all the men in the field, and to do this on a very regular basis. So one of these was called the Great Hunt. Now, to understand this for a minute, you have to think about the Great Hunt as being very, very different from just hunting in general. Mongols did a lot of hunting. It was a way that they drilled their accuracy with their bows, if they could shoot something from horseback while they were riding at a clip and hit it. And they were notoriously good at it. I mean, there are some accounts that say that Mongols would shoot a fox and be able to call which vertebra they were going to hit with the arrow. So an astonishing level of precision. And Mongol archers were saying things like, well, if you can see it, you can shoot it. They were that good. So they did this all the time, but the Great Hunt was different because it required them to maneuver en masse. And it was an exercise that was overseen by the Great Khan, the Mongol ruler himself, so that he could examine the efficiency of his officers' command and maneuvering of the men, and the effectiveness of the men themselves. The name for the Great Hunt was called the Nurj, or sometimes the Jarga, and it would happen every winter once a year. It was done at the time that the clans would gather together under the Khan. Sometimes there was important business to discuss, matters of succession, matters of who was going to rule different areas of the newly conquered territory. And of course, there was going to be a lot of eating as well, 9 days of eating. So the food for all these thousands, hundreds of thousands of people is going to have to come from somewhere. And doing a mass hunt was one way to supply that demand. But the hunt wasn't just for obtaining things to roast and eat. It was very much designed to practice specific battle techniques that they were going to need to use in the field against human enemies. So to begin the Great Hunt, thousands of riders would form a long line, sometimes 80 miles long. And they would spread out into a right and a left wing at very regular distances from each other. And the idea would be that you would have a right wing and a left wing that would spread out at this regular set of distances and eventually meet. So they would enclose within their circle a very large expanse of territory, hundreds of miles. Now, the idea was to corral all the animals that were inside the area enclosed by their ring. And in order to do this, the Mongol horsemen had to work in shifts, both day and night, so that at no time could an animal slip between the riders and escape this loop. And so they worked in shifts, and they also had hunting dogs, and they were very, very vigilant to make sure that nothing escaped detection. So that itself has obvious battlefield applications in terms of sneaking up on other forces that you might encounter if you're doing a reconnaissance or something of that nature. The penalties were very severe for any Mongol whose lack of attention allowed an animal to escape. So once the riders had formed this ring, they would very, very gradually begin to close the ring. So it would become smaller and smaller. And because it was such a large expanse of terrain that they were trying to encircle, this process didn't just take a few days. It took weeks, sometimes 2 or 3 months. So it was an extended exercise of being out in the field, maintaining constant vigilance, and following orders. So gradually, this ring would become smaller and smaller until finally it enclosed a territory that was no larger than 10 miles in diameter. So you have to imagine what's going on inside these 10 miles that are now completely encircled. All the animals that had been roaming around over hundreds of miles are now jammed together in this really small amount of space. And so you could expect to see bears, stags, deer, foxes, whatever was crawling around on the steppe is now stuck in this small space. And you can imagine the animals being fairly nervous and jittery and panicked about their proximity to each other and the inability to kind of move away. It's at this moment that the Khan himself enters that 10-mile ring and takes the first shot. And he would do this with a bow and arrow, because this was the weapon of choice for the Mongols. They were devastatingly effective with it. That's how they hunted, and that's how they fought on the battlefield. So the Khan would shoot at whatever he wanted, and when he was done, other Mongol officers in order of rank would have the opportunity to go into the ring and shoot as well. And this would go on. There would be a very large number of dead animal bodies in there by the time they were done. But the Mongols didn't kill everything in the ring. In fact, they deliberately released a certain number of animals to ensure there would be sufficient animal stock for the hunt next year. So, the hunting tactics that the Mongols employed on the Great Hunt were exactly the same maneuvers that they would use with great effectiveness on the battlefield. We have many examples of Mongols using this same technique to separate and surround smaller bodies of an enemy army and then just completely annihilate them. So, the ability to communicate along a line across fairly large distances and to maneuver in sync with each other made them incredibly effective on the battlefield. And the Great Hunt was just one of the ways in which the Mongols kept their armor bright, if you will, made sure that their skills in this area were regularly exercised. It's very likely that other steppe tribes also had traditions of hunting, but very few are known to have had anything so large, so disciplined, and so coordinated as the Mongolian version. While the Great Hunt has disappeared from Mongolia, there are other sports that exist today that come directly from the same Mongolian traditions. In fact, there's an annual festival in Mongolia. It's called Nadam, and it's based on what Genghis Khan himself, one of the greatest Mongol leaders in the 13th century, defined as the three manly games. Genghis Khan encouraged or even required these activities of Mongols at the height of their power to encourage combat readiness. And the fact that these activities survive to this day is a sign of how deeply rooted they are in Mongolian tradition. The three manly games that Nadam is based on are wrestling, horsemanship, and archery. And they are the center of the Nadam festival. But there are a lot of other activities that go on there as well. The festival is sort of a showcase of Mongolian customs and traditions. And so there are artisans and there are handicrafts and there's a particular kind of Mongolian fiddle and Mongolian throat singing. Mongolian throat singing is fantastic, and you can actually sample some of these sounds in a genre known as Mongolian metal. There's a band that's come out of Mongolia quite recently called the Hu, which is spelled H-U, and they're amazing for fusing both metal rock sounds with traditional Mongolian instruments and throat singing. It's absolutely fantastic, and I always have them playing whenever I want to lift heavy in the gym. But let's talk about the three manly sports, and we're going to begin with Mongolian wrestling. In present-day Mongolia, wrestling training for boys starts at the tender age of 3 or 4 years old, and the sport has incredible national prestige. Professional wrestlers can get lucrative sponsorships, they can become famous. Some people have even used their success as wrestlers to kind of get a leg up into starting a political career. So there's serious social capital in wrestling and Mongolia, and that's why people start so young. Some of the conditioning for people who want to become professional wrestlers is really amazing to think about. It's quite grueling. It includes hiking. It includes carrying other trainees, so people your similar size, around for certain distances. People in training have been known to carry their partners across shallow rivers, which, if you've ever tried just walking across a shallow river, you'll know that the footwork on slippery rocks underneath the surface that you can't feel is always challenging. Doing that with 200 pounds of someone else's body slung across your shoulders would really be very challenging, and that's why it's part of the training rituals. There is also plyometric drills, strength training, running up hills, and of course, specific technique and footwork they learn and sparring. So unlike in Olympic wrestling, where there can be a lot of grappling or struggling on the ground, in Mongolian wrestling, you can win simply by throwing your opponent to the ground. As long as you can get the other guy to touch the ground with something other than his foot before you do, then you win. In this respect, the rules are fairly similar to sumo wrestling, but in style, it's very, very different. Mongolian wrestling is unique in that there are no weight classes. There are no age limits. There's not even a time limit. So you can be up in that ring against a guy twice your size for any amount of time. The wrestling match isn't actually in a ring. It takes place on open ground, and it's supervised by a referee. The surface that's used for the sport is usually grass or dirt. There's no bouncy mats or, boards that have a spring in them or anything like that. There are subtle differences in the rules for wrestling depending on where it's being played. There are certain styles that pervade Mongolia itself, and then there are other styles that take place in Inner Mongolia, which is actually a province of modern-day China. But in all cases, striking, choking, or joint locking is not allowed. Now, if you go and look up images or video from Mongolian wrestling on the internet, and I encourage you to do so, it's very interesting, you might initially be confused by images of, two guys seemingly dancing around or hopping around with their arms extended, and it doesn't really look like they're fighting, because they're not. The way that a Mongolian wrestling match opens is with this ritualized dance, sometimes called the eagle dance because the postures are supposed to imitate that particular animal, but sometimes it's called the phoenix dance or some other animal depending on the style. When the dance is over, the wrestlers slap their bare thighs in a signal that they are ready to begin. In the Nadam festival, the wrestling takes place in rounds, and so the winner of particular matches will proceed into the next round and so on by a process of elimination, and the wrestler who's left standing after all the different rounds receives the title of Avarga, or Titan. So he's the champion of that year's Nadam. The outfits that Mongolian wrestlers wear are very distinctive, and they're very culturally based. It's not an option. So it consists of a pair of boots, a set of trunks. It sort of looks like a man's bathing suit, but not the boxer kind. And then this little jacket, which is very odd because there's a strip of fabric across the middle of the back. There are some slightly puffy sleeves, but it's completely open in the front. And tradition says that the reason for this is that a woman once competed in Mongolian wrestling and beat several men. And so this is the reason why the required costume for Mongolian wrestlers makes it completely impossible for a woman to disguise herself, because bare chest is required and visible for everyone. So what you'll see when you're watching Mongolian wrestling is the men are sometimes bent over, they may be grabbing a leg, they may be using a sleeve, they may be pushing or pulling, throwing themselves onto the other, anything that they can do to sort of off-balance the other guy and make him stumble so that he hits the ground with something other than his foot. There's a large repertoire of very specific techniques that are unique to Mongolian wrestling. And a lot of them have to do with footwork, with different ways that you can use leverage and holds on an opponent to off-balance him. There's use of sleeves, there's use of legs. And many Mongolian wrestlers have used these techniques quite effectively in other styles of wrestling. We've seen some of this seep over into judo, also sumo wrestling, and we've even seen some MMA fighters attempt to wrestle with Mongolian wrestlers and not do very well, simply because the tools that are being used are so different. And so you don't know what to expect. You don't see it coming unless you've also trained in that style. So they've actually been incredibly effective even when they've competed in other disciplines of wrestling. Now, while women are prohibited from participating in Mongolian wrestling at Nadam festivals today, there have been very successful Mongolian female wrestlers in the past. For example, there was the daughter of a ruling Mongol in Central Asia from the family of Kublai Khan in the 13th century. She was named Kutulun, sometimes called Ay Yaruk. The accounts we have indicate that she was an excellent athlete and horsewoman, as well as a brilliant wrestler. In fact, she's famous for having set a challenge that any man who wanted to marry her would have to beat her in a wrestling match. And so if the man won, then he would get to marry her. And of course, she came from a wealthy and powerful family, so that was very desirable. But if she won, he would need to pay her 100 horses. So she ran this challenge countless times because she kept winning. And legend has it that she accumulated 10,000 horses in this way. And we have to remember, in Mongolia, horses are wealth. They were incredibly valuable. They were used all the time. You could sell them. They were in demand always. So this Kutulun became a very wealthy woman due to her athleticism and her skill at wrestling. Also, perhaps the ability to bait the egos of men around her into thinking that this would be an easy victory. Mongolian wrestling continues to have high cultural status today because it embodies many of the values that Mongolians hold dear, and these include things like sportsmanship and even chivalry. For example, if a wrestler's clothing gets tangled or too loose at some point in the match, the other wrestler will stop and actually assist his opponent in fixing that clothing before they resume. So there's no taking advantage of some sort of accident to win the game. And if a wrestler succeeds in throwing the other one to the ground, he will actually stop and help his opponent back up to his feet before he goes off to begin his victory dance and celebrate winning the match. And when a wrestler loses a match, he will actually do this ritual pass under the arm of the winner to formally acknowledge the other's victory. It's fairly clear why Genghis Khan would have encouraged wrestling as a form of preparation for battle and continuously practicing necessary skills in the 13th century, and why wrestling remains popular in Mongolia to this day. In fact, any culture that has a warrior tradition very likely has wrestling right alongside it, because it trains the movements you're going to need for when the battle goes to the ground, when you knock your opponent off of his horse, or you yourself get knocked down in a battle and now suddenly you're on the ground. And this is where wrestling maneuvers come in really handy. Wrestling remains an excellent way to train aggression, timing, and force, all of which are incredibly valuable in a real-time confrontation. The second of the three manly games is horse racing. It's not hard to see why this was so important for the Mongol Empire. That was how they successfully moved on the battlefield and conquered so much territory. They were excellent horsemen. And to this day, at the annual Nadam Games, horse racing is a great spectacle. Now, there are numerous different races that are held during the festival, and they are divided by the type of horse. There are races just for stallions, races for geldings, races for horses under 3 years old, races for horses between 5 and 6 years old. So there are these very, very specialized competitions. But perhaps what's most interesting is the length of the races. Some of the longest horse races in the world. 2-year-old horses will race for 15-kilometer distances. The stallion race is 23 kilometers, and horses between 5 and 6 years of age can race between 25 and 30-kilometer distances. These distances are probably derived from the large distances that Mongolian warriors would have to cover in a battle. You might be riding very, very quickly to surprise an enemy. You might have to do a feigned retreat and then turn around and ride again. So being able to ride at high speed for a prolonged distance was an important skill, and it's something that's reflected in the way the races are structured even today. But the other surprising thing are the riders. So you would think horse racing, these big horses going fast for so long, you would think that you'd have, these sort of jockeys, hardened men who do this all the time. But in Mongolian horse racing, the riders are children. Children between the ages of 6 and 12 years old are the ones that are riding these horses. And they're doing this on very, very light saddles with often the most minimal or no stirrups at all. Because the idea is to minimize the amount of weight that the horse is going to carry and thus encourage the maximum speed that it's able to maintain over that distance. And these children riders are both boys and girls. It's very popular with both sexes. And the idea of seeing a child riding a horse like this, bareback in some cases, or at no stirrups at all, has got to be astonishing to watch. Now, we've been talking about Mongolian mounted archery throughout this episode. It was sort of the bread and butter of how the Mongolians did what they did, to be able not just to ride a horse fast, but be able to shoot very accurately with a very strong bow. This was something that was necessary for all Mongolian warriors. In Mongolia today, even now, boys will start riding at the age of 3. I don't know too many North American parents who would be ready to put a 3-year-old child up on a horse by himself and sort of, train him to ride. Here we put them on a pony that's on a rope, that's being led on a slow walk, and that kid might as well be sitting in a stroller for all the thing that he's doing. But in Mongolia, it's very, very different. Because riding a horse is so important, it's important to start training as soon as possible. So at the age of 3. And by the time they're 5 years old, Mongolian boys are not just riding horses, but they're training to shoot arrows on bows from horseback. And they will be hunting small game, things like birds and foxes and rabbits, as a way to train their accuracy at actually putting an arrow where they plan to place it. So men, women, and children compete in the archery competitions of the Nadam festival every year today. And this reflects the fact that both sexes, men, women, and children, have been practicing this for centuries. The archery competition at the Nadam festival is done standing. There are other competitions for mounted archery that take place in different places at other times of the year, but the annual Nadam festival features a standing archery competition. Men will typically compete to hit a target at a 75-meter distance. So men will compete to shoot 40 arrows at a 75-meter distance, which is more than 200 feet. It's not a small amount of space. Women will compete at a 65-meter distance, shooting 20 arrows. So you have to keep in mind that the more arrows you shoot, the more exhausting it's going to be. Mongolian archery involves recurve bows. So these are not bows that, you kind of pull back and will hold the bowstring for you, allowing you to rest at the full extension. These are bows that basically, the farther back you pull, the more tension is on the string and the more demanding it is for the muscles that you are using. So every time you do that for an arrow, there's a tax on the body. And so firing 20 arrows or 40 arrows, it's not easy. We have actual physical evidence of how demanding using recurve bows is on the human body. There's a very specific muscular development that happens in the hand and the arm and the shoulder. And we can find evidence of that even in skeletons that have been buried in Central Asia today. You can tell who were the archers. So it's not just that your arm gets a little bit stronger. It really does change the body to make this activity possible. And because it's so hard to pull back on that bow, the amount of force that it releases on the arrow allows it to travel accurately over much longer distances. So, for comparison, English longbowmen were very famous in the Middle Ages. They were some of the best archers in Europe at the time, and they could shoot and hit an arrow at a distance of 228 meters. Mongolian bows, by comparison, can hit a target at 320 meters. So it's a very significant increase, and that's reflected in the amount of force that is required to draw back the bowstring. Sadly, Mongolian culture is under attack in Inner Mongolia at the moment. Remember that there's Mongolia, which is a separate country, and there's Inner Mongolia, which is a province of China. The Chinese government in Inner Mongolia is now insisting on a Mandarin-only language policy in schools, which threatens to wipe out the transmission of Mongolian language, and with it, the incredibly rich array of traditions and activities that we see in the Nadam Games themselves. This policy towards minorities in China isn't limited to the Mongolians who live in Inner Mongolia. We've seen even harsher tactics employed toward minorities like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who we're going to hear more about in a few more minutes. However, there are movements that have emerged to attempt to preserve some of the traditions and activities of the Eurasian Steppe. The World Nomad Games had its first competition in 2014 in Kyrgyzstan, and this now takes place every 2 years. Now, in case your geography is a little bit rusty, Kyrgyzstan actually borders China to the west, and it's one of a number of countries that are sometimes referred to as the stans that exist in Central Asia. We've got Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, and sometimes Iran is lumped into that number as well. So it's right next door to China. And Kyrgyzstan established these games specifically to celebrate the traditions that are not just in Kyrgyzstan, but that are shared with nomadic peoples across the Eurasian steppe. The World Nomad Games feature specifically horsemanship, wrestling, and archery because there's a legacy of those activities in all the countries of the Eurasian steppe. Competitors at the World Nomad Games come from across Eurasia, representing countries like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Hungary, Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan. So I'm going to turn away now from talking about horse racing and archery and wrestling because I've saved the best, the most shocking, and the most dangerous of all Central Asian games for the last. Now, in Canada, the most popular sport is clearly hockey. And hockey gets a lot of criticism for the injuries that players sustain. I mean, you have these large men crashing into each other on ice skates, slamming each other into the boards, getting into fisticuffs, using their wooden hockey sticks to beat each other. And so, concussions, bruises, cuts, these sorts of things are fairly commonplace. So in the United States, football is the national religion. And there too, people talk about injuries, shoulder injuries, torn muscles, concussions, occasional brain damage, because again, you have men colliding with each other at high speed on the field as they play this game. And let's not forget about rugby, for those of you who live outside the States and sniff at football and hockey as not being anywhere near as tough. The scrums in rugby are famous for the kinds of injuries that they can dish out. And I once had a high school teacher come to class with one of his ears distended at a complete horizontal from his head. It was barely attached, it was swollen and purple, and I was shocked to see this, but I found out that it had happened because he'd been at the bottom of a rugby scrum, and someone had stepped on that ear from above and pinned it to the ground, nearly ripping it off of his head. So injuries in sports are something that we're familiar with, but all of these sports absolutely pale in comparison to the Central Asian sport I'm going to introduce to you now. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Buzkashi. Some people have described Buzkashi as what polo would look like if it was played in jail. But even that doesn't come anywhere close to describing how absolutely gruesome it can be. It's a game played on horseback, at very high speed. Men are frequently thrown off their horses and risk being trampled and killed. The object of the game is to get this animal carcass and to keep it long enough to get it into the goal zone. But while you're doing this, you're under attack by pretty much everyone else on the field, all the men and their horses. It's like playing bumper cars with horses. Legs can be shattered. People can be kicked in the face by horses. There's whipping, usually for horses, but you can be struck with a whip that someone else is using in any direction. The injuries that Buzkashi players sustain can be horrific, and death is not an uncommon result in a game. Buzkashi is currently played in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, and China's far west region of Xinjiang. It is also the national sport of Afghanistan. One of Afghanistan's best Buzkashi players, Mohammad Hassan Pawan, has broken every one of his fingers, his legs, his ribs, his arms, and his jaw in the course of his very successful career. He describes the game quite simply as war. So men are risking death and disfigurement for the sake of victory and reward. Some matches are more lucrative than others. Mohammad Hassan Palwan's best match saw him walking away with $17,000 US, a couple of camels, earrings for his wife, and 2 AK-47s. But he says not all matches are rewarded quite so well. To prepare for a game of Buzkashi, or war, there's a lot of gear that men will put on in an attempt to shield themselves from some of the worst dangers they may encounter. They'll wear heavily padded jackets because being dragged on the ground by a horse is a very real possibility. They will wear helmets. In fact, men in formerly Soviet countries are notorious for wearing old tank helmets as a way of protecting their heads in a game. They will wear shin padding, knee pads, and they'll carry a whip to use on horses and perhaps on other people. But perhaps the most terrifying piece of gear is the fact that they will actually insert iron rods down the sides of their boots. Do you know why? It's to protect their shins from shattering as horses slam together with their leg potentially in the middle. To prepare for a game, a goat or a calf is beheaded. Goats are usually used because they're lighter, but sometimes calves are used for special games. And the carcass is then disemboweled, which removes some of the weight and a lot of the mess. And the hooves are also removed because they might cut the hands of riders that are reaching for the carcass in the course of the game. The carcass is then sewn up, and it's often left in a pot of salted water for 24 hours. And the purpose of this is to toughen the skin and to make it less liable to split during the course of the very violent game that it's going to be used in. This animal carcass is the ball. So, footballs were originally pigskin. The idea of using an animal carcass as a ball wasn't invented in Central Asia, but unlike the rest of the world, they still use meat. Now the game begins with the carcass at one end of the field, and all the players on their horses are jostling around it. Buzkashi players usually ride horses, but in some places like Xinjiang, they may even ride yaks. The horses jostle violently as riders attempt to pick the animal carcass off the ground. Now you have to get this picture into your mind, because when you realize what's involved, it's terrifying. So imagine yourself on a horse in the middle of this scrum of other men on horses. There's this animal carcass on the ground. It weighs about 100 pounds, sometimes more. And in order to get it, you have to slide down from your saddle, somehow remaining on your horse, but you have to slide down low enough to grab this carcass with one arm and somehow haul it and yourself back up into the saddle. But while you're doing this, you're surrounded by all these other guys on horses. So as your head is descending toward the ground, the chances of it encountering some other horse's hoof, that's a pretty good chance. And what if some other guy decides to whip your horse at the moment that you're doing this? What do you think happens then? The answer is something very painful, nothing very good. But these are the risks that are happening from the moment the game begins. Now, when a player finally manages to seize the carcass and get himself back up into his saddle, he then has to keep control of it as he rides the entire length of the marked playing field to circle around a flag at the other end. And once he's past that, he's got to get back down the length of the field to where he started and hopefully deposit this carcass into a bucket or a hole or some sort of area that's marked as the goal zone. But while he's doing this, he's being chased by every other guy and his horse on the field. And they're doing everything they can think of to get that carcass from him. I don't know if this is where the phrase "get your goat" originates from. It seems to me that it's a pretty fair possibility, because to have the goat taken from you after all the effort that you've gone to get it would be a deeply frustrating and angering experience. And that's the meaning that that phrase still has. So you have to imagine this rider desperately trying to keep control of this carcass as he rides at full speed, trying to outmaneuver every other guy and their horse that are coming after him. The rider is not even allowed to throw the carcass over his horse and let it rest on his horse. He has to support that weight. And remember, it's easily 100 pounds or more. He has to support that weight himself, either with his arm or by hooking his leg around it and holding it tight to his horse as he rides. So that's very physically demanding while your horse is galloping at top speed and other horses are coming in like bumper cars, slamming into you. One of the tactics that's often used by other riders to win is to try and force the guy with the goat off the field because the area of play is marked. So if you cross a line, if you're forced off the field, you have to forfeit the goat and you're out of the game until the next round. So other riders can obtain the goat by this means. So you could have people wildly veering into you and forcing you in one direction or another. You also have to imagine these other riders reaching over, whipping your horse, grabbing onto the goat. And now you have these two guys engaged in a tug of war over this animal carcass while their horses are galloping at top speed across a field, and there are lots of other horses and men in the meanwhile interfering with whips and arms and impact. So it's absolutely crazy what's going on here. Buzkashi games may last for 2 to 3 hours, which is absolutely grueling for the horses and the riders alike. In some versions, players may work in teams of up to 12 players, but very often the game is played as every man for himself, and so you're really competing against every other guy on the field. Horses may be trained for up to 5 years before their first Buzkashi game, so there's a whole lot of preparation that's required, both physical and in terms of maneuvering, before a horse is ready to be exposed to the insanity of one of these matches. And the danger is not limited to the players and the horses. Spectators can also walk away with injuries if they're not very quick on their feet. Because what will happen is the part of the field that's going to be used for play will be marked off, but all the spectators will gather around that area. And if you have horses that are coming at top speed and cross the line, they may very easily land in the crowd. And so if you're a spectator for this game, you have to be ready to get up and run at any time as horses and men come careening unpredictably in your direction. Otherwise, you risk being trampled. Now, in Afghanistan, because Buzkashi is the national sport, there are formal rules and even corporate sponsorships. But in other countries, such as Tajikistan, it's often played as part of a wedding celebration, where the father of the bride will sponsor a game by putting up a sum of money, say $1,000. And that is going to be the money for the game. So the game will be played, and every time a rider deposits the carcass in a goal, he scores a point, which may be worth, say, $100. So when there are 10 points scored, every rider who got one of those scores gets $100, the money is used up, the game is over. Now, when we talk about Afghanistan, I know that most people are thinking Taliban, terrorists, bombs, and so on, because that is all we hear about Afghanistan in the news these days. But it's not really an accurate representation of the history of that country, and even what it looked like relatively recently. Before the Taliban, there was a Soviet occupation, but before that, and for quite a long time, Afghanistan was a monarchy. And so that monarchy, that rule by a king, only ended in 1973. While Afghanistan was a monarchy, it was quite common for the king to sponsor Buzkashi games every year. In those days, the king's men would ride to the northern parts of the country looking for the best Buzkashi players, people who had been rumored to be excellent at the game. And the king's messengers would then invite them to come to the capital city, Kabul, and play in the king's game. The problem, of course, was that many Buzkashi players were poor men. So playing in the king's game offered them a moment of glory, and even a moment of perhaps national fame for a short amount of time. But it also meant weeks of missed wages that they could ill afford to miss. They were given a bus ticket to Kabul, and often a wealthy patron would lend them a horse to ride in the game when they got there, because some of the glory would go to the owner of that horse that was involved in winning the game. But it wasn't always an easy thing for these Buzkashi players who were summoned. There's an account of one man from the 70s who said that he was invited by the king's messenger, and he said, I would like to, but I can't. I have to work. And the king's messenger said to him, really? Well, if you don't come to Kabul, the police will make a party in your house until you do. So, with that sort of a persuasion, there were very few who refused the invitation. But when the men got to Kabul, it's not as though they were put up in any sort of fancy accommodation. They would sleep in canvas tents close to the field where the game was going to be played. And while they might receive a monetary reward of some kind if they scored a point, they were also risking death or very serious injury. To this day, in Afghanistan, Buzkashi games often involve Afghan strongmen or warlords who sponsor the games, who put up the money that draws the players to come and compete. And in fact, in recent years, owning excellent horses and sponsoring a stable of Buzkashi players has become a status symbol for some of the more powerful men in Afghanistan. This is in some ways not so dissimilar from things we've seen before in history. I mean, Roman generals were famous for sponsoring games and festivities, bread and circuses, if you will. And it was a way of gaining popularity and also increasing their prestige and their status, demonstrating their wealth by their ability to sponsor these festivities. And so there's this element that still exists around the game of Buzkashi in Afghanistan. The actual meaning of the word Buzkashi is goat pulling or goat grabbing. But in terms of where the game originated, it's not entirely clear. One gory legend asserts that it originated with the Mongols, who played the game with a live human prisoner as the ball. It's a horrifying thing to think about, but it's not that dissimilar to other methods of torture and execution that have existed in other places. For example, in medieval England, there was a technique of execution called drawing and quartering, where a person would have each arm and leg stretched out and tied to a different horse. So there would be 4 horses. And when the prisoner was firmly tied to all 4 horses, they would then whip the horses, causing the horses to bolt and forcibly dismember the unfortunate prisoner. So if the Mongolians played Buzkashi with a live person, it would have been a more drawn out and horrifying version, but very much the same idea. Whether the Mongolians actually did this or not, I can't say for sure. But they have a very detailed reputation for acts of horrific cruelty, so it's entirely possible that they may have. But Buzkashi is just as likely to have evolved from actual stealing of goats, which would be something that wouldn't be uncommon amongst different tribal societies on the steppe. You'd ride into a neighboring settlement, reach down, grab a couple of their animals, and ride away. Voila, you have free dinner. Yes, it's hazardous. Yes, there's probably going to be a return party of those people coming into your village, but it keeps life lively. And the skills that are required in Buzkashi are exactly the ones that would be required for that kind of an activity. The game has obvious applications to mounted maneuvering in battle as well, because the incredible amount of chaos and the violence and the horses and the men and the whips, things colliding in all directions. But being able to be focused and precise in the middle of all that is what Buzkashi teaches you, which is why it's described as war. So the game resembles very much what many battles would look like until the age of firearms, which dramatically changed the way men and their weapons maneuvered when they encountered each other. So in this episode, we've covered a range of the different activities that were commonly used by people on the Eurasian steppe, which gave them such an edge in their confrontations with other groups of people. The Great Hunt was sort of a mass war game, training coordination and communication over long distances. Wrestling is a small-scale confrontation, training individual force, agility, and speed. Archery trains the use of weapons, which were absolutely critical for Mongolian effectiveness, and not only the Mongols, but any other mounted steppe people, of whom there were many. Then there's horse racing, which trains the ability of both of the rider and the horse to maintain stamina and effectiveness over long distances. Again, an absolutely critical skill. And finally, Buzkashi, which sort of puts all of these things together. It involves the speed and the skill with a horse. It involves a huge amount of physical strength, not just at the muscles, but in the mind, and the ability to take enormous risks in pursuit of a goal, and to maintain an ability to function under absolute chaos and the threat of very serious injury at all times. So these activities are not specific to any one ethnic group or tribe on the Eurasian steppe. Whether we're talking about Huns, Mongols, Sarmatians, the Xiongnu, the Scythians, all of these groups had a common skill set, which enabled them to be effective in their geographic region and when encountering people outside of it. And so they developed these mechanisms to train these skill sets and to refine them. And these activities that survive until today are traces of these previous groups and civilizations. They're shadows of a way of life that has, in most cases, vanished, but left this footprint. And it's amazing that these activities that are still visible today offer us a window into what life looked like on the Eurasian steppe hundreds, thousands of years ago, perhaps even as far back as when horses were first domesticated. They are a mirror of a history that has vanished. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with someone else who you think would feel the same way, and perhaps even leaving me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And stay tuned, because our next mini-series is going to cover one of the most savage warrior queens in history.